In this interview, I sit down with Kellie Wilkie and we discuss a research journal on rib stress injuries during the Rio Olympiad. Kellie has immense experience in the sport of rowing with massive contributions in both physiotherapy and research literature. Let me take a minute to tell you more about her background. Kellie graduated from the University of South Australia in 1998 with a Bachelor of Applied Science in Physiotherapy. She established her own private sports-based practice to be able to offer the best quality physiotherapy service to patients and to be able to structure a workplace that was optimal for her own health and well-being. In 2007, Kellie completed her postgraduate clinical master's degree in sport physiotherapy through the Trobe University in Melbourne, and shortly after gained her Australian Physiotherapy Association title of Sports Physiotherapist. Kellie is currently a member of the APA, Sports Physiotherapy Australia, Physiotherapy Business Australia, and Sports Medicine Australia. She is a Tasmanian Institute of Sport consultant physiotherapist. Kellie provided physiotherapy services for the London 2012 Olympics as part of the Australian rowing team and was lead physiotherapist for the Australian rowing team for the 2016 Rio Olympics. Kellie has a special interest in the assessment and treatment of the following: rowers, shoulders, and backs. Welcome to the Leo Training Podcast, a podcast focused on scientific and real-world expertise on training strategies between your ears, behind the oar handle, on the field and court, and in the strength and conditioning room. I'm your host, Joe DeLeo. I am a strength and conditioning coach, speaker, and lifelong student focused on continuous improvement. Thank you for joining me, and let's roll to today's episode. Kellie Wilkie, welcome to the Leo Training Podcast. Thank you so much for coming on to the show. I'm thrilled to be able to have the opportunity to sit down with you and discuss your work with Rowing Australia and your career in physiotherapy.
It's a pleasure, Joe.
Thank you. So I guess let's just kick things off. And you've worked with Rowing Australia for a very, very long time. So why don't you talk to us about how you started your own clinical practice, what that's called, and then how you become a physiotherapist for Rowing Australia. So what's the backstory behind it all?
Sure. I've been a physiotherapist for 21 years now, and I have run my own practice for most of that, which is quite an unusual story. I started as a new graduate physiotherapist straight into private practice and actually really hated it. I was in a really high turnover practice, seeing a lot of people over short periods of time and burnt out really quickly, which is not an unusual story to hear. And so I gave up the profession altogether after working for about 18 months as a physio. And I actually went and worked for my dad in his small business. And he sort of pointed out after I'd been doing that for a while that really I had enjoyed studying physio very much, and I had done very well at studying physio, and maybe I should have a second go. So what I did was I canvassed most people in my community. I live in Tasmania in Australia, and to see if I could see people over longer treatment times, even if they paid me less, and no one was really interested in that. So I set up my own practice really only 2.5 years out of uni, seeing people over much longer treatment times, and I was fortunate enough to have a really experienced sports physiotherapist contact me and want to work in that way too. So we worked together and I provided him a job and he educated me. So it's it's a bit of a different startup story. But essentially, to cut a long story short, I swam competitively. I started seeing lots of swimmers. I started travelling on junior Australian swim teams and open water teams. And in Tasmania, we don't have a whole lot of elite swimmers. It's a bit colder than the rest of Australia where everyone else swims. And we had a whole lot more elite rowers. And the Tasmanian Institute of Sport asked me to look after my first rowing crew in 2004 with the lightweight men's four going to the Athens Olympics. And from that point forward, I've seen a whole lot more rowers than what I have swimmers, which has been a huge learning curve, but it's been a sport that I've really, really enjoyed learning about and that I've travelled extensively with, if you like, over the last particularly sort of 10, 15 years.
Wow, that's absolutely incredible. So I'm curious, so your initial kind of professional experience in the clinic, do you recall like how long those treatment sessions were with patients? And then when you opened your own practice, how long were they then? Because you extended the time. So
Yeah. So the initial treatment times were 20 minutes, and that was whether you had a new patient or a reassessment. So 3 people an hour, and very long days from 8 in the morning till 7 at night, and often on a Saturday or a Sunday as well. And when I started my own practice, I started seeing new patients over an hour and reassessments over half an hour. And my practice, that's now called Body System Physio, now employs 15 practitioners, 13 physios and 2 exercise physiologists. And to this day, we still keep those long treatment times. And I'm a huge believer in the fact that you need that long period of time in initial contact, if you like, in initial consult, to be able to make a really great connection and rapport with the patient and have time for shared decision making. And that really sets you up for success with making sure that the patient's on board and is empowered as part of their rehabilitation plan.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So you definitely went with the quality over quantity approach, and it may have taken some time to build up, I'm sure, but it definitely has probably gone a long way into building that trust with the patient.
Yeah, absolutely. And really it was set up in the first instance to provide myself with a job. I didn't enter into running my own business thinking that I was going to build an empire, but certainly we've got a large practice now with lots of really fabulous young people, and making sure that you're keeping to those things that you set up for yourself for every physiotherapist or every exercise physiologist that you put on, and making sure they have a similar experience as a young learning practitioner is something that I'm really passionate about.
Wow. So are you, I guess at this point in your career with the practice, are you still seeing patients as actively, or are you kind of doing more the mentoring, teaching, and management part of the clinical practice at this point?
Yeah, great question. I'm in the practice 3 days a week, and I see patients 2 half days a week at the moment, which is not a lot. It's the least that I've ever seen patients, and that's only evolved over the last 12 months. And I do a huge amount of mentoring and teaching within the practice. So whenever I'm there, I'm pretty much have contact with our younger, less experienced practitioners, and I work from home 2 days a week, basically to run the practice and have big slabs of time where I can get through lots of work, but also I'm using that time to work on other rowing tasks and rowing articles, rowing education, making the time to be able to I suppose put education together to put back into the development end of the sport after leaving the elite end of sport after the Rio 2016 Olympics.
Excellent. So it sounds like the focus now on the rowing front for you, is it some of that content, that education material focusing on maybe junior rowers and more athletic development versus the elite high performance end? Is that accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. So I travelled with Rowing Australia from 2008 to 2016 and travelled every year with an Australian rowing team. So from 2010 to 2016, that was the senior Australian rowing team. And that took up a whole lot of my time, and so did treating those athletes in an elite environment in Tasmania here as well. Since 2016, I've stepped away from doing that, and mainly because I need to be home now because I've got a couple of kids that have just entered high school and need me around a whole lot more. So essentially when I stepped away from the sport, it became really obvious that what happens when you end up spending a lot of time in an elite sport or in any elite sport is that you start off treating juniors with the least amount of knowledge that you've got, and you end up treating elite athletes with the most amount of knowledge that you've got. But actually our developing athletes need that amount of knowledge. And so myself and Dr. Larissa Treese, who's a sports physician that I've travelled with Rowing Australia, decided that we really needed to put some education together to put that back into the grassroots end of the sport. And Joe, I know that you know rowing well, and we have a huge problem with low back pain in adolescent rowers, and we've got a really great idea on how to change that. But that information is not readily available for kids that are starting rowing. And so we have started doing some education within Australia, a little bit of education overseas, mainly with rowers face-to-face and with practitioners, physios and doctors, to upskill them around the country on how better to provide services for our developing rowers. But we've started to do a bit of education in the coach space now as well that's proving really fruitful.
That's fantastic. And that's very, very exciting and for sure something that is definitely much needed because I'm sure you would agree if we can educate and empower the younger athletes and get them developing good habits at an earlier age, hopefully that will transfer to not only better performance, but healthier athletes and ones that aren't getting injured as much.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that we learnt travelling with Rowing Australia over such a long period of time is we could really make a huge difference to how long a low back episode went for with elite athletes. But the one thing that we couldn't change was how often elite athletes got low back pain. And what we know from the low back pain literature, whether it's in sport or in the general population, is your biggest predisposing factor to an episode of low back pain is a previous episode of low back pain. And most of our elite athletes are arriving at that end of the sport having had an episode of low back pain. So if we can change that and reduce the incidence of that in our junior athletes, hopefully we can be making a pretty significant difference at the elite end of the sport as well.
Yeah, 100%. So in your opinion, where do you think we need to start with the junior athletes to try to start taking those steps?
Yeah, I think the really tricky thing with rowing is that rowers start rowing when they start growing. And so our education is labelled growing bodies, particularly for that reason. And so the really tricky thing about that is that you're losing relative strength and losing relative flexibility at the rate of knots in a sport that requires huge amounts of flexibility and huge amount of trunk strength in particular. Our experience is in males, when they grow, they lose flexibility at the rate of knots because their long bones grow so quickly, and female rowers really find it difficult to keep up with the demands of the sport from a trunk strength point of view, and quite possibly because they're not laying down their testosterone as quickly as boys and gaining strength just from doing the sport. So two of the really big things that we focus on are gaining strength, trunk strength in females, flexibility in males, and then the big third element is training load and just how much rowing load these young bodies are doing. And often when you sit down with schools, they're doing a whole lot more than our elite rowers were doing at that age. And more is not more with this sport. You can get fit in other ways. So we're big believers in making sure people have to have the physical attributes to be able to cope with stepping up through greater rowing load over time.
Yeah. So continuing the athletic development, conversation. So as they're younger, instead of just training with high amounts of volume strictly in rowing, they can do cross training, whether that's running, cycling, swimming, other sports, still getting in perhaps that lower intensity endurance work they need in developing their cardiovascular system, but they're not spending the majority of their time solely in their sport. And then if they continue to move up into the, U23 or senior team ranks, then they would be spending more and more time in the sport. Is that the idea?
Absolutely. And I interviewed our men's sculling group going into the Rio 2016 Olympics, and not one of those athletes was doing more than 4 rowing sessions per week when they were 16. Wow. So we really, I know, it's quite phenomenal, isn't it? A lot of our school kids are doing a whole lot more than that. They were playing cricket, they were playing Aussie rules, they were playing rugby. And when you think about the sport of rowing, your bottom's stuck to the seat, your feet are in your shoes, and you are loading exactly the same tissues repetitively all the time in a young growing body. You go and do something like rugby or Australian rules football where you're changing direction all the time, loading different tissues. And I think that's got a fair bit to do with it. We can still gain that sort of base level, if you like, T1, T2 endurance training from doing lots of different other activities. We end up moving in bigger social circles, so we end up enjoying the sport more as well. And certainly the volume that you're doing as a young person doesn't dictate success. We know that Kim Brennan only started rowing in her early 20s after a swap from high-level athletics after getting a stress fracture in her foot. So these are the stories that we need to be telling our 15 and 16-year-old talented rowers, that more is not more, and being able to, play a wide variety of sport and load a wide variety of tissues in our bodies is probably a really great way to go.
Yes, absolutely. And the other really important point from an athletic development standpoint is when you play a multitude of sports, not only physiologically, muscularly are you getting overall development, but from a skill and motor control standpoint, they're going to be much more diverse. It's just going to make them an overall better athlete too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, when you look at the elite end of the sport, that's really evident. And, the people that are doing super, super well, even at a junior world rowing championship level, don't always go on to be the best senior rowers. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
Very cool. Very cool. So one of the other questions I had for you in the outline was, so where did your interest in studying within the sport of rowing, the low back and the shoulders come from? Was that you just, when you went through your coursework for physiotherapy, were you interested in that part of the structure and the anatomy of the human body, and then it continued in the sport of rowing, or was it as the injuries came up that there was a natural curiosity there?
Yeah. Look, my interest in the shoulder has been long-standing, and I think that goes back to why I became interested in becoming a physio in the first place. I have multi-directional shoulder instability, swam at a high level, I had lots of visits to the physiotherapist for my own personal injury rehabilitation, and became fascinated with the shoulder. And then when I started travelling with swimming, I started treating the shoulder a lot. And so that's essentially the patients that I tended to see all had shoulder problems, and I suppose I developed some expertise in that area. But when I turned to treating more rowers, certainly rowers don't get as many shoulder issues as what swimmers do, and it was low back pain that was coming through the door all the time. And travelling with the Australian rowing team, that's what I was seeing, day in, day out. And so I would say, these days I see plenty of high-level young swimmers and plenty of high-level young rowers. And so really my lists are made up of low back pain and shoulder pain in a private practice setting. So it really has just evolved over time. The low back is something that I wasn't that interested in and didn't have a lot of expertise in before I started working with rowing.
Sure. Okay. Very cool. So there's definitely a personal connection with the shoulder there.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So coming back to some of the work you did with Rowing Australia. So as the lead physiotherapist, in doing some research for our interview, I was watching one of the YouTube videos where they sat down and talked to you, and you talked about how your kind of your role in your day or week was broken up, and it went into detail in talking about how you would communicate and check in with other physiotherapists who were stationed throughout the country working with other high performance athletes with Rowing Australia, and then of course you're doing your day-to-day treatment of the athletes. So I was just hoping you could kind of just talk about that experience a little bit and how that structure works, and how that also how do you manage it all, right?
Yeah, so up until this Olympiad, the Rowing Australia system had been a decentralised system. So what that means is that we had rowers in every state in Australia preparing domestically to be able to go to the Rowing Australia trials that tended to happen around February or March each year. And then rowing crews would be selected, and they would be sent to different states of Australia with regards to where the coach was and where they'd be training to prepare for the international season before they went overseas. And the Australian rowing team would go overseas for 3 months, leading into a World Championship or an Olympic Games, and mainly be located in northern Italy, where the Australian Sports Commission have a training facility there. And so my job during the domestic season was to keep an eye on all of those people that may get onto the Australian rowing team. So we had lead physiotherapists in each state for rowing and doctors in each state for rowing that I would check in with when people had significant injuries, make sure that they were being well looked after, give them ideas about things that they might have considered or may not have considered to be across those injuries, and get an idea of how the athletes were progressing. And then when athletes were selected into crews, I would be doing the same thing, but also in Tasmania, I'd be looking after the lightweight men's crews and the heavyweight men's sculling crews, because they would be based in Tasmania, training before they went overseas for that international season. Then when we'd go overseas, we would usually have 2 or 3 rotations of medical staff, so no one needed to be over there for the whole 3-month period. Most of us work in private practice and partly with Rowing Australia as well. So we would have go overseas for anywhere between 4 and 6 weeks and have a rotation of doctors and physios working with athletes across the country doing that. So it was quite a significant role. It was a large role, and it would be done from pretty much my dining room table at home. I was the first person asked to be the lead physio for rowing outside of the Australian Institute of Sport. So often people would be in Canberra where the administration of the sport was, and that was a little bit easier. But certainly with technology these days, it makes it easier to operate outside that. In this Olympiad, we now have the men's team based in Canberra and the women's team based in Western Sydney. And so if I was to still be involved in this Olympiad, you would need to be located with the athletes. And so it was, in some ways, it was good timing for me to leave the elite end of sport and leave it in really good hands with a head male physio and a head female physio in both locations now. So it's a very different setup, this Olympiad, but certainly the whole time that I was involved in Rowing Australia, it was quite a complex system, but it worked pretty well.
Very cool. Very cool. Thank you for that information. So clearly you were busy pretty much all the time.
Yeah, I was. Running a large private practice and being lead physio of Rowing Australia is not something that's sustainable for many years on end. Yeah. So over that time, my husband was working a whole lot less and doing all the school drop-offs and pickups, and we were trying to get the kids and him overseas at least every second year to be able to have a good experience at the end of my rowing trip. Since finishing with Rowing Australia, I've stepped back and I'm working a whole lot less and he's working a whole lot more. So you certainly both can't be working that hard all the time.
Right. Well, that's incredible. So clearly working with Rowing Australia, and then also, moving forward and progressing with your own private practice, your entrepreneurial endeavor, which at this point, as you shared earlier in the review, has grown. It's you have a full staff.
Yep.
Okay. So, one other thing that came up in the video was talking about physiotherapy, sort of when you're training in Australia, and then when you go to the events and competitions, and then when you're gone for the 4 to 6 weeks. So I guess one of the questions I have for you is, for you as a physiotherapist, how does that work when you're sort of on the road, right? So you're not in your normal environment where you have a treatment table or TheraBands or the tools at your disposal. So how do you adapt to that? When you're on the road, do you bring those materials with you, or do you try to locate them locally and source them?
Yeah, so we were fortunate enough every year to be able to have a training base at the European Training Centre in Varese in northern Italy. And so we would actually ship a big container with all of our boats and all of our equipment that we needed over ahead of time. And so that would include portable physio tables to take to competitions and all the supplies we might need. But also in that European Training Centre, which is where we lived for that period of time, there was a big physio treatment room, a big open room where when we were travelling with the team, we had 2 physios, a massage therapist and a sports physician with us. And so we would all treat in a similar area and be able to assess people together at that time. And that worked really well from a learning perspective, but also worked really well from just being able to see people on a daily perspective with how they progressed. So essentially, we were only taking top-up equipment that we needed from a year-to-year basis, and that still happens now. So it's a relatively straightforward procedure, which is quite nice. But certainly there's some challenges around living with a team and working with a team over a long period of time. So we needed to put some parameters to be able to, if you like, look after our own health and well-being while we're away, in terms of not treating before breakfast and not treating after dinner in training times. Certainly in competition times it would be a bit different, but also having a day off a week and making sure we're looking after our own health in terms of exercising on a daily basis as well. So there certainly comes with its challenges, being rowing competitions being so far away from Australia, but it also comes with some really fabulous benefits in terms of the athletes being able to have, their best possible care all in the one spot and being able to access that whenever they needed to. With that comes, I suppose, some challenges with dependency, where it's really easy for athletes to access services. So making sure you're continuing to empower athletes and make sure that they can self-manage and make sure that they're just not relying on the fact that you're down the hallway from where they're sleeping, certainly has some challenges around it, but was something that I think that we did a pretty good job at over time with a mature and large athlete group.
Excellent. So the next question I have for you is, so looking at sort of the sports medicine continuum, right? So we have on one side, we have our healthy athletes, they're training, and then on the other side, we have an athlete that an injury may have occurred. They're working with yourself, going through physiotherapy in that rehabilitation phase, and then they're coming back into performance. So we have strength and conditioning. There's probably a doctor or physician, depending on the injury involved, and then also the rowing coach. So talk to us a little bit about the communication between all those staff members working with the athlete and how it works along that entire continuum.
Yeah, I'm a huge advocate for the fact that we need to create opportunities for people to speak organically in these situations, because everyone has something to offer. So a very small amount of my work with the Australian rowing team would be around treating injured athletes. I became fascinated with the performance end of the sport and being able to have an influence on how a crew performed, that you get to know people's bodies really, really well, and going out in the coach boat and watching the athletes move that are uninjured and having a contribution towards making sure they're moving in a way that will stop them getting injured but also improve performance is something that I became really fascinated with, and I spent a huge amount of hours in the coach boat. So when I'd be on tour in particular, I'd be out in that coach boat every day with different crews, and certainly in Tasmania I'd be out at least once a week. And a lot of that was around the coach and I looking at things together, trying to improve things. And that's the best incidental contact that you can have, rather than a telephone call after a treatment session, right? But the other thing that we would have overseas is if we were overseas for a long period of time, we would take a strength and conditioning coach with us. We would travel with an exercise physiologist or a sports scientist as well. And if someone was injured, great thing about all being there at once is you could all sit down with the athlete, the coach, every single other person that would have input into their rehabilitation plan, write it all up on a whiteboard, everyone make agreements with what needed to happen, everyone actually make a pact that that's what we were sticking with, that this is what the plan was, and being able to track whether we were able to stick to that plan and be able to make changes to that plan over time was really important as well. And that's really essential for absolutely best quality medicine, getting people back to a return to sport in full capacity, full training capacity, including S&C, and including their on-water training and including all of their cross-training, and being able to balance all of those competing influences that everyone's sticking their hand up, wanting the athlete for over time. So working collaboratively in that space was really easy overseas, much harder in the domestic environment, but we would do it in the small pockets that we had with small groups of people, and the more face-to-face contact you can have doing that, the better, absolutely.
Wow. I really love that idea of, when an event would occur, you'd sit down with everybody in front of a whiteboard and everybody would have an opportunity to speak, but also it was a great tool to get everyone on the same page so that it was very transparent what the plan of action was and what everybody's role and responsibilities were.
Yeah, absolutely. And you usually have something that you're aiming towards. Like you might have an acute low back episode, 2 weeks out from a World Cup. So then you could plan backwards. What does this person need to do in the World Cup week if they're not going to be at full capacity by then? And then how do we fill in the gaps between now and then? And how do we make sure that, this is not the major event of the year, the World Championship or Olympic Games is. So how do we make sure that we're, keeping some training load up over that period of time as well? And there's, lots of different ways to be able to get to where you need to be. But are we looking at the long game or the short game, and what are we prioritising? And then coaches could say, you know what, I've got 2 sessions a week that are really important. I don't want this athlete to miss out on. We're going to make sure they're in the boat for those times. Reserves are in the boat for other times. So it really makes for transparency, but also for real buy-in from the coach and athlete as well, so that they're working collaboratively with the sports medicine staff.
That's great. Yeah, and buy-in and trust is so important. So my next question for you then is, with that experience that you accumulated over the several Olympiads with Rowing Australia, how is that helping you? Because you're part of the low back pain pathway for World Rowing, right? So
yeah.
How are you folding that knowledge and experience into the low back pain pathway that you and the rest of the committee are working on?
Yeah, so I've become, I suppose, the clinical expert as a part of that group. So we met 2 years ago in London and decided by being led by Fiona Wilson to put a clinical low back pain pathway together, an optimal management pathway for rowing. And what we found when we looked at the literature is that there is only one study looking at the optimal management of low back pain in rowers, and that's in an adolescent schoolgirls group that was done here in Australia and Western Australia. There's no other research looking at the best management of low back pain in rowing. And so what we decided to do at that meeting is to do a systematic review of the literature on the epidemiology of low back pain in elite and sub-elite level rowers, to do a systematic review on the biomechanical risk factors for low back pain in elite and sub-elite level rowers, and also have a look at the management of low back pain across all athletes, because we really didn't have anything to look at when we looked at just rowing alone in the sub and elite level population. So different people within that group have taken on leadership of those papers, and Jane Thornton is looking at the management paper. What we decided to do at that point is that we really needed to go to experts throughout the world and figure out how they were looking at treating low back pain in rowing. So my job within that group was to take on the process of running a Delphi survey to survey all of the experienced physiotherapists, doctors, anyone that works with elite and sub-elite level athletes, rehabilitating them after a low back pain episode throughout the world. We ran a really large survey. It took an hour to do and to get really comprehensive qualitative data. And we got 32 responses from that around the world, which was a lot more than what we thought we would with such a long survey. And we were able to collate that information and be able to develop a whole lot of statements that had come out of that information and separate them into your first initial triage of the episode, your subacute management of low back pain, your acute management, and then also the rehabilitation phase. And from there, we sent all of those statements off to what we would call an expert panel that had been involved on either a FISA medical commission or as a lead physio or doctor for a nation, and looked after rowers for more than 10 years, and they rated those statements, and we had 13 responses to that, and in the second round 12 of those 13 people participated again. So I've just finished writing up that paper. Hopefully we'll submit that paper for peer review in the next couple of weeks. It's been a humongous undertaking, but it's really fabulous in terms of the rich quality of data that we got out of such a wonderfully experienced group. And the expert and experienced group had very high levels of agreement, which tells us that we all are treating low back pain in a way that we probably know works, but no one has really looked at researching it. And maybe we need to be looking at that as a follow-up to this Delphi survey that will come out hopefully over the next couple of months.
Wow, that is fantastic. So a ton of work going on in the background over the last 2 years with everybody that's part of that committee and on that staff. So really cool. So I'm looking forward to that coming out. We'll have to stay tuned for when that's released. Looking forward to reading it.
And that will become part of the clinical guidelines. So we'll basically be looking at what the research says and what the experienced clinicians say, and then putting together a clinical pathway or a clinical guideline for treating low back pain in rowers. And that's led by Fiona Wilson of Ireland. And it's pretty exciting to have been a part of that with some pretty fabulous people throughout the world.
Yes, yeah, I remember reading the article on World Rowing, and it was kind of the all-star lineup with the who's who on the clinical side of things. So it was pretty cool. So is the pathway going to include, so obviously the clinical side and athletes in pain, they're working with a clinician. Is it going to kind of move them along that continuum to where they're getting out of pain and going from rehab to back to performance, and then some potential suggestions or guidelines for, say, the rowing coach or strength and conditioning staff as well?
Yeah, certainly. It will basically cover from first initial presentation to full return to sport. And I think that's something that we really haven't explored in the sport of rowing before, which is really important. And making sure that there's collaboration for full return to sport across all people that are having input into a rower's training program. So that's quite exciting, which is great. Yeah, absolutely.
That's so cool. That is so cool. Okay. So the kind of the second part, I want to dive a lot more into, and you mentioned it briefly when we first started getting going earlier in the interview, the educational entrepreneurial endeavor that you're doing with Dr. Larissa Therese, right? Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you can call her Dr. Larry if you like. Yep.
Larry? Dr. Larry.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So it's called Growing Bodies.
That's right.
Okay. So how did you two come up with the name?
It's a really interesting story, actually. We essentially started writing up our injury and illness data that we had collected across the 2 Olympiads that we'd been involved in high level rowing in Australia, so the London and Rio Olympiad. And we didn't have time to do it while we were working in Rowing Australia. And that article actually has just been submitted to BJSM and should be published soon as well, which is quite exciting because no one's published data with relation to illness in particular before or over such a long period of time. So we were looking at our data and we were thinking, gosh, that if we could change these athletes before they got to this level, that could make a really, really big difference. And we actually sat down in a cafe in Melbourne with Drew Ginn, that most of the rowing community knows. He's a triple Olympic gold medalist, and he's just a really big thinker. And we went, look, we feel like we've got a lot of knowledge that we could pass on to the grassroots end of the sport, but we're not really sure whether there's going to be an appetite for it. We're not really sure in the best way to do it. And he said, well, we were talking about rolling out courses, and he said, well, you need a catchy name. And we're like, oh, all right. And that's the last thing we were looking at. We were looking at what the course content would be like, when we were going to advertise it, where we were going to do it. And over coffee, pretty much Drew came up with that name, which is pretty cool. So we're actually now, we're still running ideas past him, and he's keeping it real for us. We've developed an ongoing relationship with Drew over time. And actually his daughter is doing all of our illustrations for the online education that we're wanting to launch over the next 6 to 12 months as well. So it's been a real collaborative effort.
I was going to ask you about that. Because I think I caught on Twitter, I think, did she do the illustration in the rib stress injury article?
She did.
Okay.
Yeah, she did. So she's an 18-year-old. She's a very clever artist, and she did that illustration for us. And she's also doing some illustrations for us with regards to being able to describe good posture for rowing, and certainly some of the exercises that we think are key for young growing bodies as well. So, the Ginn family have had some decent input into what we're doing.
Very cool. That's excellent. Excellent. So what are the next steps? Obviously, you said you're taking some time to work on content, and you've done some courses, I believe. So what are you kind of working on right now, and where would you both like to see things go?
Yeah, so we started with running courses for physios and doctors in Australia, and we've run quite a few of those throughout Australia now, and they've been well attended. But the really tricky thing is that not everyone can make them at the time that we're running them, and don't want to particularly travel across a large country to be able to come and do that course at a decent expense. And so all the feedback that we've got is that if there was an online version of that people would be very happy to do that in their own homes, and that would be time and cost effective. And certainly when we've started running coach courses, that's they're even more time poor, if you like, than medical practitioners. Getting them along to a one-day weekend course is pretty tricky. So that's the feedback that we've been given as well. So we're starting to look at putting all of that content for coaches and for physios and doctors onto an online platform where people will be able to buy a package or be able to buy lectures to be able to educate themselves. It's obviously a pretty massive undertaking, but we think that we've got a lot of information to share. We want to make a huge difference to young rowers, across our country and across the world. We've had some approaches from the UK to come and run some courses, and we may end up doing that in the latter part of this year. We're working through that at the moment as well. So it's still very much in its infancy in a lot of ways, but we really think we can make some big impact, particularly with making sure that we educate rowing coaches on what young growing bodies should be doing from a training load perspective, but also making sure that they've got the right attributes to be able to row in terms of flexibility and strength.
That's great. Yeah, that's very exciting. Very exciting. So it sounds like coming up with some things, or not necessarily standards, but potentially on a movement screening or movement evaluation side of things. These are, a checklist that a coach could run through to make sure that the athlete is physically able to get into the positions you're trying to get them in during the rowing stroke.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of that is around having enough hip flexions or enough flexibility at the hip joint to be able to get to the catch in a position that's strong and a position that protects the low back. That's first and foremost. And, the other thing that I'm quite passionate about is young people having strong enough trunks, particularly their anterior trunk wall. It hasn't been researched much at all, but making sure that you can be able to go from mid-drive to late drive, hanging on for dear life with your anterior trunk musculature. Do that repetitively with really high strength over, 210 to 260 strokes for a rowing race. We need our kids to be strong, and we need them to have great endurance. And it was a really interesting story that made me really look at how strong rowers are through their trunk and how strong they needed to be from an endurance point of view. And that was 2006, we had the men's sculling team come into my clinic, and it was just before they went overseas, and they were doing a photo shoot, and the local newspaper really just wanted a place to be able to do a photo shoot, and they came into our gym in our clinic, and they were saying, what a good rowing exercises we could get sort of from a picture point of view. So I had them on fitballs doing just really short range crunches from horizontal up to about 30 degrees. And they were all doing pretty well over 20 and then failing at 30 and 40. And I can remember standing there and looking at Rhett Aliff, who was the men's head rowing coach for sculling at that time. And both of us, really our faces dropped. These guys were about to go overseas to compete at the highest level, to prepare for World Championships in 2006. And they couldn't do more than 20 crunches on a fitball. And it made me start to think that we really probably hadn't prescribed trunk exercises at the correct endurance that these athletes need. And so I'd never really prescribed things like 5 lots of 60 crunches on a fitball up until that stage of my career. And I was a little bit worried because rowers get rib stress injuries of contributing to the compressive forces across the chest wall, and whether rolling out a program like that may help low back pain but may not help rib stress injury. And so I had a physio that worked for me that was on the Australian rowing team at the time, and he said, well, how about we do this with me, because I'm going to give you some really good feedback about the types of stresses that I'm feeling on my body and whether I think this is worthwhile or not, and be able to stop if I feel like I'm getting some chest wall symptoms as well. And so we stepped him through that program, and he really was saying that his ability to maintain posture throughout a whole training session, his ability to maintain posture over the finish line rather than just for the first half of the race had really dramatically changed since he'd started to do that sort of program. And so we rolled it out across the men's sculling program and really found that we were making big differences under fatigue. And so that's something we rolled out through the Australian the Australian rowing team over time as well, that they're still doing to this day. And it's something that I believe juniors need to do as well, that they need to be just as strong through their anterior abdominal wall. And so most of my school rowers, I'm trying to get up to 4 lots of 4 short range crunches on a fit ball to be able to be strong enough. And in everyday life, you just don't load your anterior trunk in that way, in any way, shape or form. So it's something that takes a bit of time to get someone to, but I think it makes a really big difference for performance as well as preventing low back pain.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting you said that. That was a great story. So thank you so much for sharing that. Just the background, and really cool that you and the other physio kind of, on the fly did an impromptu, test, retest, and experiment right there to see if it would be something that would be able to be rolled out, mainstream across the team. But, to your point, you need anterior stability for the ability to display posterior power if they don't have that anterior stability in the trunk. So that's great. Are those are the Fitball exercises available if people are interested to learn more about them?
Oh, look, I think they're scattered all over the place these days because on the Rowing Australia website we've had them in the trunk exercise sheets, and so I think they're scattered all over the place. I think the Decent Rowing site from lectures in times gone by, I've displayed them. Certainly through Growing Bodies, that's we really are wanting to actually provide that information in a really succinct way in terms of this is exactly how you do it, and this is how many repetitions you do, and this is how you would progress it over time. So we're trying to pull all of that together so it's really easy to access for people, and hopefully they will be there'll be resources that will be free for people to access as well.
Excellent. And then the other I think point to make sure that it's pretty clear to the audience, because we're talking about trunk strength but also trunk endurance, right? So those are two different physical qualities. So when you are working with rowers or talking to rowers, when you talk about trunk strength, what do you mean? And when you talk about trunk endurance, what do you mean? And what do you want them to have from each of those two qualities?
Yeah. So I test trunk endurance as part of a screening process, and I test it on a fit ball. Can you lie back over a fit ball in a horizontal position, your fingers touching your ears with your elbows right out to the side so that we're loading that whole anterior abdominal wall right up to the rib cage area, and can you do a small crunch up to 30 degrees? And in a young athlete, that's testing strength in particular. A lot of people can't do it without shaking like crazy, but I want to know how many repetitions someone can do, which is definitely more about endurance. With an elite athlete, I would be thinking that that's a way of training endurance, but they still need to get their trunk strength, their ultimate strength and building capacity through their trunk by doing things like deadlifts, like Olympic lifting, loading the trunk up in a much heavier way with much shorter repetitions. And so they still need to be doing both. One doesn't replace the other. And if you're an elite athlete and you're working up to 6 lots of 50 crunches on a fit ball with 30 seconds between, that's a really difficult thing to do at the end of an S&C session when you've done really great high quality trunk strength work. So it has to become a second session. And what we've found is doing that sort of work twice a week is enough to get good progress, and you can start people off on, say, 2 lots of 20 and get them up to 6 lots of 50 or 300 repetitions over about a 12-week period.
Wow, that's great. Yeah, I had the opportunity in the last couple of weeks to sit down with David Young, who's the S&C for Rowing Australia right now. And he actually said they're doing 3 S&C sessions a week and 2 dedicated, core trunk training sessions a week.
Yeah.
So.
And I think this is David works with our female rowers and is an excellent S&C coach. And in particular, it takes females much longer to get that sort of trunk strength than what it does males. And I think a lot of females actually do well in rowing as well because they're a little hypermobile and they're actually quite flexible and they actually get into really good positions in the stroke, and that's how they achieve in the first place as a young athlete. But when you're a little hypermobile, your muscles have to work a lot harder than people that are a little stiff, and so they fatigue a whole lot easier as well. So I think there's a little bit of natural selection in female rowing athletes to be on that mobile side, and therefore their trunk strength and trunk endurance is even more important. I'm a huge believer in, S&C or strength and conditioning work, so important for all rowers, but particularly females.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm just curious, with your work over the years with the lightweight team, did you see that type of hypermobility with some of the lightweight athletes as well?
Not as much, which is quite interesting. So I mainly worked with the male lightweight team rather than the female lightweight team. That the males were based in Tasmania, so not as much. But it's really tricky prescribing S&C work to lightweight athletes because you don't want them to put on too much muscle mass. So we used to spend a lot of time periodising when lightweights would do their strength work, and when we'd withdraw it to try and help them come down to weight a little as well. And certainly we keep their trunk strength work up the whole time.
Okay, very good, very good. Okay, is there anything else that you wanted to share or discuss or talk about in regards to growing bodies?
Yeah, I suppose the other element of it is the flexibility side of it that I think is really important for males. And unfortunately, males like to do strength work. They don't like to stretch. And females are the opposite. So we've got a real challenge because the boys like to play rugby during the winter in Australia and do all their strength work and keep it going through summer, and stretching is daggy and stretching is really boring. The majority of young growing males don't have enough hamstring flexibility, and there's a little bit of a debate in the rowing literature about whether hamstring flexibility is important or not, and I unequivocally think that it's absolutely essential. And it's really easy to screen a young growing male who's growing, a maximum of 12 centimetres in 1 year, whose long bones make their hamstrings very, very tight. Long bone growth makes their hamstrings really tight in a hurry, that can only get to a 45-degree straight leg raise. You can get those athletes lying on their back, one leg up the wall, one leg through a doorway, holding long hold stretches for 2 to 3 minutes, one on each side for 2 or 3 weeks, and make good 30, 40-degree changes. Really big changes in short periods of time, but it's really boring. You have to sell it to them on, lie on your back with your phone, and then half the time they lie there for 10 minutes rather than 2 minutes, which is fabulous. But from a hamstring flexibility point of view, it's certainly really important for males. And when we look at where people get to at the very end of the rowing stroke, you don't need masses of hamstring flexibility. So your feet are a little bit lower than your bottom, and you've opened your trunk up and taken your hamstrings off stretch. But what you then need to do is you need to rock over from your pelvis, which requires a huge amount of hamstring flexibility before you break your knees, so you don't slow that boat down. And if you can rock over from your pelvis really, really early in the recovery part of the stroke, then pop your knees and come into the catch, not only do you not slow the boat down, but you arrive in the catch position in a vertical pelvic position. And that's the most essential position for preventing low back pain when we put that oar in the water and create the greatest stress across the low back. So hamstring flexibility is paramount for performance and for injury prevention for boys. It's boring and daggy and annoying to do that sort of stretching work. But what we try and sell coaches with is get off the water 5 minutes earlier, and before they go off and have a shower, get them to all lie down and do their hamstring stretching. Let them have their phones or do your debrief, talk to them while they're in that position, and you're probably going to make a massive, massive difference to the incidence of low back pain across your young, growing boy rowing group.
Yes. Some interesting points you made there too. Flexibility, being able to get in those positions, for sure, very important. And I would also say that as they continue to build strength, they're going to be able to get into those positions, and probably over time, as the foundational kind of their baseline strength level is pretty high, they won't probably have to as consistently do that flexibility work because their body's going to be able to hold on to that range of motion. Would you agree? Is that experience?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're teaching really good movement patterns in the gym, really good hip hinging movement patterns, you've got an element of eccentric hamstring load, which we know builds increased sarcomeres in the muscle that increases the overall length of the hamstring muscle itself. And so those two things working hand in hand is ideally where we want to go with these young guys.
Yes. Yeah. And it sounds like one of the challenges, especially with the, with the junior athletes, because they're going through puberty, and they're going through so many physiological changes, there is literally kind of the tug of war going on internally within their body. So they have to work on the flexibility. So is there any, I guess, advice you would have, besides doing the flexibility work at the end of the session, if they're coming off the water, to make sure that they're also taking the time to build strength? So maybe from a program design or principle standpoint, things to consider.
Yeah, it has to be programmed. It really does within rowing programs. Otherwise, athletes go off and do all manner of different things and you have no control over what they're doing. And so, my main advice to coaches of young athletes in rowing is to be programming a couple of strength sessions a week, be programming their flexibility at the end of rowing sessions, not to be doing large volumes of on-water rowing, that they'll get better performance out of making sure there's a balance between S&C, cross-training and rowing. And certainly it's a whole lot more enjoyable as well. And from an S&C point of view, there's always a little bit of a debate around rowing, because rowing is something that's a highly loaded sport anyway, and should you be doing it? And certainly, very successful nations like New Zealand haven't done a lot of S&C up until recent times. And so, is it absolutely essential? I certainly think with young growing athletes it is. And we know that starting S&C programs with young growing athletes before puberty is actually very safe. It doesn't affect growth plates of growing bones, as long as it starts with low load, it's supervised, and people are doing things with really good technique. You set people up for success. And trying to start an S&C program when you're growing is really, really tough. It's really hard to actually establish the right movement patterns when your flexibility is low and when you're losing relative strength because your frame is just getting so big in a hurry. So I definitely am an advocate for starting S&C early and it being progressive, and it doesn't mean that it needs to be heavily weighted early. It might be more around body weight to begin with, but that's something that if you start early can be gradually progressed, and so a 16 or 17-year-old can be doing a really good quality, short S&C, loaded program that really protects their trunk when they're rowing.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I work with a lot of individuals across a wide range of ages and demographics, and to me, a young developing athlete, like, they need to be checking the boxes of being able to move their own body weight first and foremost. I think it's just, you learn a lot about how to hold your spine in position, just doing a press up or a push up, pull up, getting into those positions, moving your body through that range of motion. It teaches them a lot about how to create tension across their body and then also relax when they need to, which is, goes hand in hand with the entire rowing stroke.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's essentially, with young growing bodies, you want them to be able to have well-established skill across your 5 real foundations of movement, and that is a push, a pull, a squat, a hip hinge, and a single leg exercise. And rowing, S&C programs don't have to be really complex, but we need to make sure that they've got skill in each of those areas, particularly if they want to add weight to what they're doing over time.
100%. Absolutely. Well, you heard it here first. We're talking about focusing on technique first, body weight, skill, for the young developing athletes when it comes to S&C, and definitely prioritizing, sound essential technique and owning those movement patterns. So really good stuff, Kellie. Okay. I'm super excited to talk about some of the journals that you have published and been a part of. Do you want to talk about the rib stress one first, or do you want to talk about the Mythbusters one?
Yeah, so I really am a first and foremost a clinician, and I've had, I was invited to be involved in the Mythbusters editorial by Fiona Wilson, which was fabulous. And since finishing my time with Elite Rowing, I've certainly had a whole lot more time to dedicate to putting some research together in the form of articles, and that's where the rib stress article has come from, that's been published recently. And over the next 12 months there'll be quite a few to come that come out of this international low back pain guideline, and also around our large epidemiology study with Rowing Australia about injury and illness over the London and Rio Olympiad. So happy to talk to those things that have been published first, absolutely.
Awesome. Okay. Okay, so I guess a really good, I think, question to pull out of this. So the question they asked you on the myth busting was, how do you manage low back pain in the lead up to elite competition? And I love your initial response here is that when we take the therapy approach, is that it's not alarmist. We want to first and foremost educate the athletes about their injury and pain. And really important point here, we often find that the description the athletes verbalize about what their injury may look like, or the pathology as they understand it, is quite dramatic, and simple pain education can reduce their fear. So let's just start with that. From that perspective, what are some things that we want athletes to know about if they start to feel pain, recognizing what some different sensations, that type of feedback? So if we get something that's like an electrical shock, that's usually indicative of nerve pain, right?
Yeah.
So I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, sure. I think first and foremost, before anything, how we respond to an athlete presenting to us with pain is really important. So we talk in the sports medicine literature with regards to identifying yellow flags with patients that present with low back pain. And so what are their fears and anxieties around the pain that they've got? When you're travelling with a team and someone presents with an acute episode of low back pain, they're in a lot of pain, and it's pretty scary for them, and it looks pretty scary to you. So I talk to practitioners that are travelling with athletes, or that are triaging athletes in a primary healthcare setting, to not become that yellow flag. The way you respond and the calmness that you have around that person presenting with low back pain is really important. So, for instance, someone might come off the water and come up very dramatically to me and tell me how much back pain they've got. Being able to send them away and say, go and have a shower, spend some time under the hot shower, come back in my direction, and then let's have a talk about it, makes a really big difference, because number one, they're not in danger right now. I don't need to do something immediately. Walking is totally okay for a back, but also on top of that, it just reduces the fear and anxiety around it, which is really important also. And then one of the things that you touched on with regards to, examining someone and talking to an athlete about their back pain when they first present, is that there's a lot of misconceptions about low back pain, particularly in the population, and what people think it is and what it looks like. And one of the things that we talk about on our practitioner courses is you walk into a medical room and you see a model of a low back with this huge big red blister hanging off the side of it that's a disc bulge. And we all know in sports medicine practice that that's not what a disc bulge looks like, and it's not even where it happens. It's not off the side of a disc, and it's not a big red blister. It's a small bulge with a little bit of extra fluid in it in the middle of the spine. And so it's amazing what athletes think they've got. It's amazing how traumatic a picture they can paint in their brain about how bad it is. And you can imagine that if someone gets an episode of low back pain a very short period out from a major competition, this can build fear and anxiety pretty quickly. On top of all of that, they might be someone that's got 2 children at home, that's not working full time because they've given that up to follow their Olympic dream, that there's a reserve waiting to pop into their seat before an Olympic Games. And we can get a huge amount of fear and anxiety build up pretty quickly that has a direct influence on the amount of pain that someone's experiencing as well. So being able to be really calm, being able to describe what's going on, being really clear and concise about what your management is in those first steps and how confident you are about the diagnosis and prognosis for that back injury is really super, super important. And we think that the biopsychosocial model of low back pain and persistent pain is really only, there for our long-term workers' compensation patients or our low socioeconomic patients, and it's just not. It spreads right across the elite spectrum of sport, and we need to be really aware of the pathology versus the pain experience and making sure that athletes' fears are dispelled really, really quickly and that their beliefs, if they're inaccurate, are changed really, really quickly so that they don't head down that path.
Yeah. So being a calm, steadfast resource for them is super, super important.
Yep, that's correct.
Great. Okay. I'm really looking forward to talking about the rib stress injury article that just came out recently. This is titled Rib Stress Injuries in the 2012 to 2016 Rio Olympiad, a cohort study of 151 Australian rowing team athletes for, it says 773 athlete days. Am I reading that right? I think so.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so basically across the Rio Olympiad period.
Okay. So, really in-depth study here, looked across that entire time period, and it found 19 rib stress injuries, 12 reactions, and 7 fractures. And then it also broke down, there's 12 female and 7 male cases, 11 open weight, 8 lightweight, 12 sculling, and 7 sweep cases. So I guess first thing is, why don't you describe for the audience, what's the difference between a stress reaction and a stress fracture? And we'll kind of start there.
Yeah, sure. So the way that bone remains healthy is that we load bone, and a little bit of bone gets broken down, and some more bone comes along and gets laid back down to make a stronger bone to be able to cope with the loads that we place on it. And a bone stress reaction is the bone's being broken down as we load it, but we're not getting enough new strong bone coming in to basically make that bone stronger. And so you get this gap between bony breakdown and bony recovery that ends up stressing the bone, or the bone not being in a state of optimal strength to cope with the loads that are placed on it. And that's when we get some bony pain around the chest wall, so particularly the ribs in the rower. And it's quite a unique injury to the rower. A bony stress fracture happens when that pathology progresses to a point where we could actually see a very small crack in the bone. So it's a more significant bony breakdown. And so if we can catch a stress reaction quite early, we can turn that athlete around and return them to sport a whole lot quicker. If it progresses to be a rib stress fracture, then it takes a whole lot longer to turn that athlete around and get them back to a full return to sport. So we're wanting to prevent these injuries in the first place, but we're also wanting to have a whole lot more stress reactions and stress fractures within our rowers so that we're not compromising their ability to train or their ability to continue on for the rest of that season, because certainly stress fractures are often season-ending injuries in rowing.
Yeah, and a key point here is that we spent a ton of time talking about low back pain in rowing and how that's the most prevalent injury in the sport. But rib stress injuries, reactions or fractures, they actually are accounting for some of the most missed time.
Yeah, absolutely. So they're less often, but the time cost is much, much greater.
Right. So a couple other things that I thought were really great to point out to the audience. The study looked at where the location of the injury was taking place. And it seems from the work that you've done here that we've started to be able to narrow down exactly kind of where the injury mechanism continues to occur, at least from this study's perspective. So mainly ribs 5 through 7, which made up 15 of the 19 injuries in this study, particularly rib number 6. So my question for you is, so those ribs are part of the true ribs in the thoracic cage. So do we have an idea of why we're getting that 5 to 7, especially rib number 6, is kind of the one that's getting the injury the most frequently?
Yeah, it's been the biggest debate over time. And I think the really nice thing about this data set is that because these injuries don't happen very often, we just don't have enough numbers to be able to hang our hat on the fact that, this is the most prevalent area. And so, this is only 19, but it gives us a really good indication that, this is the area that gets stressed the most. And certainly they don't occur under muscle entry or muscle insertion points. So we used to think that it might be around, say, where serratus anterior inserted onto the rib. They don't occur there. They always occur on the outside of the rib. And we think because of that, there must be some sort of compressive force of the rib cage. So they're never on the inside of the rib. So we think it must be a compressive force that's giving you a real tensile stress on the outside of the rib. And when you think about the mechanism of rowing and the fact that when you're going through the rowing drive, you've got very high abdominal forces and trunk forces. You're not breathing through the drive. You've got big compressive forces from the arms that are coming up through the rib cage, and the rib cage can't move a lot because we're not breathing and the abs are on to be able to have that lovely, strong trunk movement backwards. It makes sense that it's probably some sort of compressive load. For the compression to be greatest around that mid part of the thorax, again, makes sense because you're getting loads coming from below and loads coming from the arms, if you like, that are connected to the yaws. And that doesn't sound very specific, but I think that's as good as we can describe it at the moment. What's really interesting in this article is that there was no real clear differences between open and lightweight, male and female. And what we would say by looking at these cases right across the board is that there are two really big predisposing factors, and with greater numbers we might be able to hash those out a little bit more. And one is usually around training load, that someone may have spiked their training load a little too quickly, or they've had an injury or illness where they've had a dip in load and then come back and spiked their training load. And that tends to be something that we see quite often as a predisposing factor to this type of injury. But also we would say that our athletes that are relatively energy deficient tend to be more predisposed to this as well. And traditionally in sport, that's thought of as lightweights or thought of as a women's related issue. But certainly we've had men within our sport have relative energy deficiencies because of how they perceive their body image, but also because rowing is a hugely energy-consuming sport, and being able to eat the amount that you need to be able to train well is actually really challenging. And so we think there's probably predisposing factors more around energy insufficiency and around training load than what there is with regards to gender or type of rowing that you actually do.
Okay. And so you're highlighting RED-S and bone density, hormonal health.
Yeah.
So for a lightweight athlete, because they potentially could be cutting weight and not they need to get down to a certain number, they're already going to be in a situation where they're potentially energy deficient. Is that something that could put that group or that category of rowers at a higher prevalence for the type of injury?
Yeah, that makes sense in our brains, right? But it just doesn't come up in research time and time again. And I think my observation would be that at the elite end of the sport, that's a whole lot better controlled. So athletes are coming down to weight and their training loads are being varied accordingly. So it's much, much better controlled. Lightweight athletes at an under 23 level, we haven't collected data at that level because they're spread across the country and they're a whole lot harder to collect. Certainly, juniors don't get this injury. They just don't row enough. But under 23 athletes do. And I would say that my experience is that the lightweights are very prevalent when they haven't been exposed to lightweight training. Their prevalence of injury for rib stress is, I would say, much higher than our open weight athletes in that group. But I think once we get to an elite end, the training load that's controlled when the energy is coming down to make weight makes it, I suppose, gives us a situation where they're not as energy deficient, and we just don't see these guys being injured as much as our our open weight athletes. There's not a really big difference between the two groups.
Okay, great. So one other question I had, and I was going back through, read the review several times. The study, and one thing that wasn't mentioned, but it was just thinking about, the interplay of the thoracic cage and the scapula. When looking at some of these athletes, was taking into context how their scapular movement was, and just in terms of, is the scapula upwardly rotating? Is it staying against the rib cage? Was there any, winging? Was it coming off the rib cage? That type of thing that may point to, some scapular instability, and could that also be playing a factor?
Yeah, I think as clinicians, we're pretty certain that scapular stability, scapular control, the position that we're loading in from a scapular point of view probably has a role to play. Trying to study it is almost impossible because you can't map and record the scapular movement very well, reliably at all. So being able to measure that as a predisposing factor is almost impossible. But what I would say is that it's something that I do see clinically. I see athletes that don't have great scapular control, more predisposed to this injury, absolutely. And I also see athletes that pull more with their arms and push less with their legs and overload their upper body more, being more predisposed to this injury. And certainly Anders Wittner in his PhD research looked at upper body to lower body strength ratios with lightweight rowers in particular. There were a few openweight rowers as well, and found that those with greater upper body to lower body strength ratios were more predisposed to this injury. So we certainly need to be teaching our rowers what position the scapula needs to be in when the oar enters the water, which is very much retraction around the rib cage a little, but not end of range. Needs to be strong. It needs to have, great musculature around the scapula, holding it in place statically, and then being able to put that oar in and push with your legs rather than pull with your arms. Sounds very simplistic, but I'm sure that has a role to play. It wasn't hashed out in the paper because it's just too hard to measure those individual factors.
No, I had a feeling that it was probably something that was, you're not going to be able to put your finger on it. I was thinking from a functional anatomy perspective, just some of those things. So that was great. Thank you so much for your clinical insight. Well, I think we've covered everything that we had down in terms of topics. Was there anything else that you wanted to discuss, in terms of what you're working on right now, or upcoming projects, or what you're excited about?
I suppose just to tidy off the main thing that came out of that rib paper is that the times to return to sport that we have mentioned in that paper are much greater than what previous studies have mentioned. And that's the question that we think we will get the most, the most asked, if you like, post this paper being published. And what I would say is the data set that we collected, we were very, very adamant to be really accurate with how long someone was on modified training. So you may have returned to the boat but not at full training. So how long you were on modified training, you weren't doing what the usual prescribed training load would be, and then how long it took you to get back to an absolute full return to sport. So I suspect the reasons why we've reported longer time periods is we've followed people right through to a full training load rather than just getting back on the water successfully. And that's really important to note. And it's really important to be able to measure that when people are doing research, that we're wanting post-injury to get people back to their full return to sport, their normal training load. That is the true injury cost. And I suspect these cost us a whole lot more than we ever expect from a rowing point of view. So there's something that we do need to spend a bit of time looking at how we're going to prevent in the future, because they take a lot of time to get back to full rowing load or training load.
Yeah, it takes a ton of time. And I guess part of that too is it's such a hard area of the body to isolate, because the only time we stop breathing is if we're dead. So in some ways the thoracic cage, the rib cage, is constantly moving a little bit. So I guess my question for you there is what are some of the reasons it takes so long? Is it just because of that?
It's such a good question. And I think when we really think about bony healing, we shouldn't be surprised that stress fractures do take between 6 and 12 weeks to heal. So we shouldn't be surprised because we can't hurry tissue recovery. It's one thing that we can't change. From a rib stress related injury, we really want athletes to be honest and recognising that really, really early so that we can catch it before it becomes a rib stress fracture. And I think the key with these injuries is preventing them in the first place, because we're not going to get, if they get to a fracture level, we're not going to get them back quicker because there's a certain level of time that a tissue takes to heal. And in no other area of the body have we been able to influence that. So I suspect, our time needs to be really put into how we prevent these happening in the first place, or how we catch them in the reaction stage before they get to the fracture.
So if an athlete is in the reaction stage and they were to come to you, what are words, or how would they describe that feeling, so that if somebody's listening to this, they are a little bit better informed?
They get sharp, very focal pain. The really interesting thing is it's not always over the area of rib stress reaction, which is quite interesting. And I think it's because the thoracic wall is just so highly innervated. Referral patterns are, take a rib stress injury's pain all over the place. So you could, bet money on the fact that it was in the anterior chest wall, and on MRI you see it in the posterior rib. So it really is very sharp pain. It's pain that gets worse on each rowing stroke. It's pain that's worse overnight. It'll start to hurt when you pick up your rowing bag, when you're driving your car home, in activities of daily living, and it certainly hurts when you take a deep breath or when you cough. So they're the really big signs. And if ignored, it will progress to get a whole lot worse. And so if someone's presenting to me really early with that sort of pain, we give them 5 days off the water immediately and swap them over to cross training and really unload their chest wall so that we can get them into that positive bone healing state as soon as possible. And that's where we start. And then from there, we do a rowing trial after that to see if they can tolerate getting back into the rowing boat. But early aggressive unload, I think, are the key to these injuries.
Thank you. Really, really great stuff there. Fantastic. Well, Kellie, thank you so much for taking the time to come on. This has been wonderful. Really enjoyed spending some time with you and getting to chat about all this. I think this is going to be a firecracker of an episode when we get it published.
Thanks, Joe. It's been a pleasure having a chat about rowing. Certainly something that I'm passionate about, and hopefully we can continue to make some change in that grassroots end of the sport, in the adolescent end of the sport, that will hopefully end up making a change at the elite end as well.
Absolutely. So before I let you sign off, where can folks find you if they want more information, contact information, social media, website? Through the Growing Bodies website, definitely, and Twitter. Certainly, we have I have my own personal Twitter account, and also we have a Growing Bodies Twitter account as well. And we'll certainly release the articles that have been published over the 12 months through those platforms. Excellent, awesome. I'll make sure to include those in the show notes.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the Leo Training Podcast. If this content is important to you, please be sure to rate and review so more people can listen. Also, you may follow me on social media, Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook to get weekly free content. For more in-depth content, please subscribe to my email newsletter at my website, leotraining.io. Be sure to check out the resources page to download free, helpful content. If you have any questions or feedback, please contact me directly by email at joe@leotraining.io or via Instagram. The handle is @leotraining. Thank you again for listening, and have a great day.